period. I don't see anyone present to make a public comment. Any public comments? Any public comments? If not, we will move on to the minutes from the October 26th meeting, which were in the packet. What are your wishes? Moved by Supervisor Leahy, seconded by Arsted. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Update on neighborhood investment grant submissions. Lance, I assume that's you?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. In your packet, there are there's a summary of several of the grants that Marathon County did apply for, and under your rules, certainly the HR Finance and Property Committee with its oversight responsibility relative to the budget, wanted to make you aware of those applications. We did in fact submit another application after the packet was prepared, but in total, we submitted 4 grant applications through the State of Wisconsin Department of Administration. These were all grants that were made available as part of the Badger Bounce Back grant package that the governor announced a couple of months ago. We submitted 3 grant proposals through the Neighborhood Investment Grant Program. Those were the 3 grants that were referenced within your packet. Specifically, there was a grant for the Regional Forensic Science Center, commonly referred to as the morgue. It's been discussed through the morgue task force. That grant proposal in total was $9,284,186. We also submitted a grant through that neighborhood investment grant proposal for some renovations relative to the 9 Mile County Forest. That grant in total was $1,737,000. And then also a grant through that same program, neighborhood investment grant, relative to renovations at the Big O Plain Park for $1,091,000. The one grant proposal that was not in your packet, and I can disseminate it, we can put it in a future packet if you wish, but it was a proposal, a tourism grant proposal, again through that Badger Bounce Back package of grants for some work out at the Dells of the Eau Claire. And that amount was $671,000. You might ask, well, why didn't you submit the Dells of the Eau Claire grant to the Neighborhood Investment Grant Program as opposed to the Tourism Grant Program? And that would be a very astute question. My response would be there was a $1 million threshold that your project needed to have to be submitted through the Neighborhood Investment Grant Program. So the scope of work we were looking for out at the Dells of the Eau Claire did not meet that $1 million threshold. So we submitted it through that tourism grant proposal that was available at the state. So in total, there were $12,783,186 worth of grants that were submitted. We expect to learn in early to mid-December whether or not those grants are approved by the state of Wisconsin. So in terms of matching grants, there was a reference, or matching funds, there was a reference within one of the projects that was in your packet that there were funds already, county funds that were slated to go towards the project. That project is within the CIP plan for the Parks Department. That's why those funds were referenced there. All of the other funds, and most notably the $9 million that we're seeking for the Regional Forensic Science Center, we did not indicate that there was any, that the county was obligating any funds for those projects. So we hope to hear soon if we were successful in any of those applications. But with that, Mr. Chair, I don't have anything else. If anyone has any questions, I can try to answer those, or I can get additional information for your next meeting.
Are there any questions? I think they're already submitted, so we look forward to hearing the results of those efforts. Any questions? Questions? If not, thank you for that update. All right, draft 2021 county financial report. Christie?
Yeah, super quick. We've put together, staff of my department, Susan Welly, put together a template. It's not pretty at all, but it does provide you with the information that comes out of our current financial system. And we're doing it as a template for, I may not put it in the packet. I will email it out to you. Thought I had put it in here. Well, that's not exciting. I was going to give you a big spreadsheet. It's a very simple to-do spreadsheet. I will email it out to all of the folks here. Take a look at it. That's what we're going to start with. It does come directly out of Kayenta. It is very simple, and that's what we're going to start with our financial statements to provide to you, which is budget versus actual. And I apologize it wasn't in your packet. I will email everybody, and you guys can give me your thoughts on it at the next meeting. With that, I will put you back where you were.
All right, thank you. So we look forward to receiving that and having the discussion. So we'll go back to the 1970s when we got financial
Yep.
updates. What comes around, goes around, or what is that saying?
On our way to improvement.
On our way to
We'll leave it to
improvement,
that.
thank you. Thank you for that comment.
Dollars invested.
All right, the American Rescue Plan update. This is an educational item today, so we will not be taking any action. I think we want to, we've talked about ARPA processes, criteria, and timelines, funding for eligible expenses, and in your packet were a number of attachments. One was a citizen feedback draft that Sarah Dowdett had prepared for us a while ago. Then we have the expenditure categories is an appendix 1 from the U.S. Department of Treasury beginning on page 34 of your packet that sort of spells out what eligible activities are in each of those categories. And we're still, that's based on the interim final rule from the Department of Treasury. And then inserted in your packet today was taking that list that on Sarah's list and putting it in categories or buckets based on those criteria, sort of, because we don't know the details of a lot of the proposals. We don't know if they're funded or not, but it'll just give you some context of what might fall within certain buckets based upon the ideas that have been floated to date, whether through citizens, informal discussions, and or things that we know that the administration is looking at based upon a few days ago. So you have those before us, and then there's one category, ineligible or need to clarify. There were some requests that came from the public to pay off debt. That's not an eligible activity. Send money back to the federal government. I don't think we're going to do that. Property tax refund. I think that has some nuances to it that we would be concerned about, given the restrictions and other items that needed clarification. But Lance, can you pull up the spreadsheet? So what we started to do, and we've had some discussions, for discussion purposes for today, we kind of put together a chart. Discussion purposes only, a ARPA funding allocation formula. As you're up there and again, this is not anything written in stone, it's just a process by which we can begin discussions, because at the last meeting, we talked about Baker Tilly having some software that could, or a program that could help us track things internally. We've talked about that. I have some concerns about how comprehensive it is, because it's not one that would engage the public. I think we'll talk about that a little bit later, because there are some options that are available out there, but it isn't one that would lead us through, and we still would need to make the determination in advance of that, how much money do we want to allocate in each of the buckets. So I could. But it's not going on the, are you sharing your screen?
There, it's starting. It started, it said it was going to, and then I have it on presentation laptop right now.
Okay, so it's on in the.
Is Yi on the,
From today?
Yes, he's on with.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Okay.
It looks like it's working.
all right, there it is. So what we did is, for discussion purposes, we didn't spend any money thus far in 2021. So we looked at, we've got $26,356,580 available. We have to encumber those funds by December 31st of 2024. One of the issues that the committee will need to discuss is, as we develop a plan, how much do we want to allocate each year? This plan, for discussion purposes only, says 33, 33, 33. There's merit to having the discussion going forward, and again, we can't take action today, is should that be 50% for year one, 25, 25, with the thought that we would try to respond to the pandemic? Should it be 40, 30, 30? Those are discussion points that we might want to have for the purposes of sort of driving the discussion. Then we took, and I'm just going to explain what we did going down the row. And again, these numbers are there just for illustrative purposes. The categories are public health, negative economic impacts, services to disproportionately impacted communities, premium pay, infrastructure, revenue replacement, and administration. I created another one of contingency, sort of to give us some flexibility should projects come in. Remember, we had talked about an application process. The applications flow in to the county, we review them, we then prioritize and we make the funding decisions, but we had talked about the possibility of there being different criteria for different types of programs, so it would be important to do that. So in this case, we allocated, just again for illustrative purposes, these are my numbers, nobody else's, 33% to public health, and that would be, you know, additional vaccine-related, public health-related activities. It would include mental health and behavioral health. And the thought was is that given the situation at North Central Healthcare, in the deficits that they're running, we may want to run that in there, and you run that through there, but that would be the sort of the concept that we would look at. The negative impact would be the impacts on the businesses and households, businesses, job training, small business grades, aid to tourism and others. And for everything else, for those categories, I just put 15% of the allocation in there to give you an idea what that might look like. The services to disproportionately impacted communities, that includes childcare, which we heard about as a critical issue in terms of needing to get people both into the workforce and probably to a degree supporting the existing workforce. And again, 15% for discussion purposes. Premium pay is something that we would offer to first responders and others that work through the pandemic, did not telework, had to work at a job station. We're putting 0 in there. We haven't had an outcry for that. The fact is that they were paid during that period of time. And there may be issues, well, there are issues with paid time off that we'll talk about later. Infrastructure, again, put 15% in there. We've had the discussion about broadband. There's also been discussions about stormwater projects, water quality projects in the Fenwood Creek and others that may or may not deserve funding. Again, a placeholder. Revenue replacement, that's the lost revenue calculation, and I think Kurt and Christie at the last meeting said that we will excel in that area in terms of earning loss replacement. And you see the asterisk. This asterisk assumes that North Central Healthcare is addressed as a public health category, not necessarily in revenue replacement. That would be a discussion point. We can do administration. I put 2% in there. That would be covering, if we went with a software package, any of Christie's time, and others as a way of recouping it, and then trying to just set up a contingency should we go over and others. We would have to track that contingency because, again, we have to encumber those dollars in total by December 31st of 2024. Once we go through this, and I think the thought process is we don't want to go beyond year one with these allocations because we don't know what's happening out there and situations might change. So I think just for purposes, again, for illustrating, if we took a third, 8.7 million, and we used a formula like this, this is about what it would net out to for discussions. We have to, whatever we do, we have to make a recommendation to the county board. And we can play with those numbers. But yeah, I think it's just important for us to have a process by which we can evaluate and the relative value of one versus another. And we're catching you without a lot of preparation on this, and I would encourage you, we can send this out as a draft, but it is, again, we were reluctant to put it in the packet because if you put it in the packet, oh, that's what the county's going to do, and it was not our intent to say that this is what we're going to do. And Supervisor Leahy and Lance and I had a discussion going over this as a concept. And that's where we are. We're at a concept stage. And Lance, I'll turn it over. Do you have anything? Sure.
I think, well, first, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the framework, again, is it's offered to stimulate discussion, and Chair Robinson put that together. I think it's important to note that as Chair Robinson referenced, there are a couple assumptions built into this. I think it's helpful to again, look at the public health category and say, we know we're gonna have losses at North Central Healthcare. I mean, we're gonna have a request as part of their budget. They were planning on requesting just shy of $500,000 of ARPA funds to be allocated based on a lost revenue as well as increased costs. So you know that there's gonna be a project coming there. Assuming the lost revenue number of 1.3 million, if that number is based on, again, this understanding that we can address the mental health costs, the substance abuse costs within those numbers, you can start to get a better picture of what the overall financial picture of the county is, such that you can make intelligent ARPA allocations. I will tell you that I suspect in the next month and a half, certainly by your January meeting, if not before, you'll have a couple of projects before you. One of them will be for a project to update the audio video equipment here in the courthouse and the courtrooms. We have the sheriff's office working with CCIT, our clerk of courts, and our judges. I've been involved trying to put together what that project will look like. That project is going to be about $750,000 is my initial understanding. You're going to have that at least $500,000 or thereabouts request from North Central Healthcare to simply balance their budget. There's also a program, as Supervisor Robinson referenced, with premium pay. This isn't really within the premium pay category, so it would likely fall under revenue replacement. But throughout the pandemic, we instituted employee work policies that were designed primarily to ensure that we had staff available to perform the work for the public that we needed them to perform. Some of those things limited travel. They also, just as a practical matter, our staff limited travel to be in compliance with dictates from the state. The governor's initial orders limited non-necessary travel. So we had people, for a wide variety of reasons, accumulate significant time off balances. And from an operational standpoint, if we have all of those people, with 750 staff, if we tell them, you need to reduce your balance, because we elevated our balance to accumulate, to accommodate those facts that I laid out. If we say you need to be back under our normal balance limit by, let's just pick a date, July 1st, we're gonna have a lot of people take a lot of time off, which is gonna have a significant impact on the public. Because like I said in my budget message, the delivery of government services is a people business. And so I'll be putting together, working with Christie, a proposal where we would essentially, on this, based on all these circumstances, allow individuals the opportunity, if they choose, to cash out some of those, to a limit, cash out some of those balances. Other individuals will certainly just take the time, and they've earned it, so they can do that. But you'll have that, I should have that wrapped up by the end of the year as well. So those are just a couple of projects that are currently in the works. You've already seen from the public listening sessions that there are some other pieces that are likely to come. As Chair Robinson referenced, there's a project from the ERC committee relative to some work in the Fenwood Creek relative to water quality, enhancing water quality, so that will come before you. So you already do have a number of projects that are going to come before you for consideration.
Any questions on the concept? I think we have a number of decision points that we need to make at a future meeting. Again, how much of the 26 million do you want to spend each year? And then, are you comfortable with this bucket process?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The one, I'm not holding what we have done in the allocation, and I think it's a great start to the concept. The one question that I still would pose to two things, two concerns that I have. One, first off, we have interim final rules, which, understanding the Treasury has made the comment that they will not challenge anything that is spent under the interim final rules. We are going to, at some point, get some final rules. One of the forsures is lost revenue. And I'll make the argument that we allocate the maximum to lost revenue because two things. That provides this county the most flexible use of those funds that we can utilize them for, and it doesn't subject them to recapture by the Treasury as long as they're authorized under state statute for utilization, period. So when you have right now an agreed amount, and this number would go up, $6,859,950 of lost revenue that has already been identified by our finance department and our auditors for 2020 alone. We also have additional lost revenue calculation potential for 2021, 2022, and 2023 that we haven't determined yet. Obviously, we haven't finished those years. But my argument would be that we place that amount into the lost revenue, and that gives us, that doesn't mean that we can't utilize public safety or public health as an item under that, but we have eliminated the potential of clawback if a project doesn't meet the Treasury's definition of that bucket. I understand the willingness to try to place those in buckets. However, I think when we do that, there's an expectation that we're going to meet that number. And that's the challenge that I have is, okay, so we put in, for discussion purposes, we put 33% in public health. We know that NCHC is going to be requesting a significant portion because of the challenges that NCHC has faced and the nursing home. Because any time that there was a positive case in the nursing home, admissions were limited, in fact, were eliminated. So it really became problematic for the census, as this committee's heard. So my argument would still be that we have the greatest flexibility by putting the dollars that we know qualify in lost revenue. That's not to say that we're not going to utilize them in these appropriate buckets, but I would put, or appropriate departments potentially, or entities, but it gives us the most flexibility without the potential caution of recapture by the Treasury. That would be my only thought.
I don't have a problem with that concept if, and I'm going to condition it. One of the concerns that I have is that we have a fiduciary responsibility entrusted to us by Congress to allocate these dollars for pandemic relief. And, you know, I think we have a responsibility both to the corporate entity of the county as a business unit and a responsibility to the citizens at large from that fiduciary and public trust document. I don't have a problem if we put money into lost revenue, but then I would hope that within that lost revenue, we would mirror these categories and say, if we're going to do it in there, we're going to put public health, and then we would look at how much we're going to allocate to North Central Healthcare, driving us, if we get, they're tracking it on a federal level, and I think we would want to try to honor the wishes of Congress when they created these categories. But I'd like to make sure that we're addressing, are we doing the vaccines? Are we doing the behavioral health? Are we doing the substance abuse, which are North Central Healthcare that are driving that? I think we need to carve out some money for those specialty projects. The nursing home doesn't, I don't think, qualify under any of the categories outside of lost revenue. But I just throw this out there as a way to drive it. And whatever point you put in there, or whatever percentage you want, that's fine. But I would argue that we ought to, even within the lost revenue, reflect these categories to try to just track it so that we can report back to the public from a transparency perspective and an accountability perspective on how we spent those dollars. But other thoughts? Jonathan?
I actually like the idea of basically both of those two things. Essentially, making sure that the allocation max to the loss replacement, because then we're just basically securing those dollars effectively under the umbrella of the loss replacement. But then noting that the whole point of these dollars is to do the work that we need to do to help recover from the pandemic. So essentially saying that, yes, these dollars are secured, and then stepping back again to allocate essentially where we stand in this rough analysis here. So they're taken in, they're protected effectively, and then deployed accordingly to where the need is greatest. So kind of matching those two together, that sounds like a great idea. My one question is, in the contingency factor, just the assumed 5%, how exactly would that work? Would that just be a contingency held and then spent if we went over on any of the other percentages?
I think the thought is that for the first year, let's say that we're opening the process up. We've got 3 grant cycles, you're getting them in. If we had projects of merit that were above that 1,317,000, we would be able to reallocate that. You have to be careful because the contingency needs to be encumbered. You can't carry it over. So I would think it would be a one-time contingency that you would carry over for the first 2 years. The third year, you can't have a contingency because you have to encumber those dollars. It was a way to address some of the uncertainty and create a pot of money, if you could, to dip into should you have a meritorious project or idea within that area. So it's not, a contingency is not an encumbrance. And so we have to be careful of that.
Thank you.
Kurt, you were gonna.
Yeah, I guess I was going to agree with you to a certain extent. At the same token, I think we have a fiduciary responsibility to handle these funds with the public's trust in mind. And what I mean by that is we are not going to spend them just to spend them. We are not going to go out and say, okay, once we have this allocation, this is not etched in stone. And that's why I still make the argument that the lost revenue gives us the most flexibility, because if a project comes to the board and the board agrees that that project is the most worthy funding, and we didn't have it allocated into a category, now we have a discussion about, well, can we take it from this category or take it from that category? And that becomes, I think, potentially a hang-up that the board may get wedded to, that, we have, 2-point-some million in public health, and if that project comes in and doesn't fit into that category, and yet we want to use it, that's why I'm still making the argument that we use the most in lost revenue, because it gives the board and this committee the most flexibility it wants to have for those, because it's, again, I think you're absolutely correct in the assumption that we are entrusted to utilize these to bring the economy back, but and spend these dollars in the taxpayers' eyes as the most useful, because this is potentially a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And to be able to utilize these so that we're putting and setting Marathon County and the taxpayers up for success long-term from a financial standpoint is really what we're trying to do, and also address the concerns that came up during the pandemic.
President Leahy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Overall, I like the idea of the allocations. It's an obvious way to show that we've thought about the prioritization of these funds. And ultimately, I think it's actually going to help us narrow our focus and make the application process even smoother. I think going into it with just this giant pot of lost revenue money is kind of more difficult to ponder. You know, it's a larger sum. Anything can happen with it. Allocating or prioritizing in some way that we've decided on as a body, I think will help us streamline the application process because we are adhering to those governmental categories that were given to us. And I think it's just going to, help streamline the applications that we take in and really make us focus on them fitting somewhere. At least if we could do that as our first step, I think was part of our criteria, you know, making sure they fall in. So whether or not we accept or we do the lost revenue and then allocate, I guess I just like the idea of having this categorization somewhere in the process up front. So we're showing people that the optics are gonna matter, you know? And I think just having that large sum isn't exactly the same optics, the same purpose as showing this prioritization.
I agree. I think the categorization is great. It's a starting point. I agree with that.
I think that there is room for us to do what Kurt is advocating for, and then what we're trying to do, and we can look at it. Maybe what you do is you create it within the lost revenue replacement, these categories, and you kind of roll them out. And they're targets, they're not absolutes. Because if something comes in at $200,000 more, and we don't know where we're going with broadband right now. We have some concepts in play, and one of the concepts is to make a loan available to the ISPs that is a refundable loan, or they would pay us back based on that. That would be wonderful because we could check off the box, and we would have a revenue stream that would not be encumbered going forward. So there are some advantages to us to look at that. We're going to stumble. Now, I don't think we're going to feel our way through the first year. We're going to stumble our way through the first year because we've got ever-changing, we've got interim final rules, which means we don't have final rules. We have Congress that is continually enacting legislation that will affect what those eligible costs are and activities are. But if you're in agreement, what we can do, I think the fundamental issues that we have to sort of agree to is what percentage of the allocation do you want earmarked each year? Is there a desire to have a little bit more the first year? Even, do you want to feel your way through it? You can always go back and check that out or revisit it. But for planning purposes, do we have, and we can't make that decision today, what do we want to allocate? Do we want to get a flavor? You know, Lance has got, Administrator Leonard has some projects that are catch-up. They're retrospect, one is retrospective in the buying back the paid time off. That's an expense we've incurred. Do we want to do that, and do we want to carve that out of the, hypothetically, do we want to carve that out of the 26 million and then divide the rest by 3? Those are some discussions that we would want to have when we've got a little bit more information, and how do those projects fit in? But are you comfortable with this? We can bring back to you a refined allocation process at the next meeting, but sooner or later, we've got to go to the board. And, the question that we'll have to work through with Michael and others is that if we take a formula in, is that sufficient to expend the funds within there, or will we have to bring the projects back for approval of the county board to amend the budgets? So we'll have to figure out how we can word the language in such a way to give us the ability to adopt a plan that will meet the budgeting constraints, because we need a 2/3 vote to amend the budget. We're going to have to put these funds into various budgets. According, Christie's would look for you know, how we would put the money in. How will we go about doing that? I think we've got to work on the mechanics. Kurt?
Yeah, I guess I'm not at this point convinced that we want to allocate one-third, one-third, one-third. Two things that come to my mind that are really big challenges that I think we have to face. One is we have interim final rules and what those final rules are. We have some major legislation that has taken place, infrastructure, that is going to bring roughly $1 billion additional revenue to the state of Wisconsin for infrastructure, and this is quote-unquote hard infrastructure. The estimate from WCA is about half of that is going to come directly to counties. So that means about $500 million of additional revenue above and beyond what we normally currently get under normal funding levels for infrastructure is going to come here. We have a piece of legislation that's passed the House with potentially up to, one can argue where the actual number is, $2 trillion for potentially human infrastructure, which may address some of the items that we may get requests for. It is going to have the other thing that is going to happen in the quote-unquote infrastructure bill is there's going to be additional resources available for broadband expansion that we know of already, because one of those additional buckets that are coming to the state of Wisconsin is hard infrastructure, but that does entail additional funding for broadband. We will know by the end of next year the broadband project that this board has entered into an agreement with, and the projections are that that project, at least according to Mr. Schneider from Bug Tussle, is we're going to have almost 400 miles of fiber in the ground. Now it keeps changing. We haven't gotten a final 412 miles of fiber in the, excuse me, and a half, and 22 feet. But my point to that is, now we then can go out and identify. So I guess I don't want to spend dollars where we have potential other dollars coming into the availability from other sources, whether that be the infrastructure bill over the next 5 years, whether that be a potential human infrastructure bill if that ever gets passed in whatever form that is in. I don't want to duplicate our efforts, but don't want to shortcut or short spend or short fund any other areas that need some. So I'm a little more cautious to say that I want to guarantee to spend the $8 million. Now, we will have a better sense, I think, once we go through the application period. So that's why I'm not convinced that we need to allocate today based on today's number until we actually see what that application is and we actually do some hard work and look at those applications and find out whether or not those applications even meet the criteria or where the need is. We will have potentially identified additional needs throughout the community. I mean, one of the things that we have on the allocation is negatively economic impacted entities. All right, how do we define that? And how do we determine whether or not, do we ask for, if it is a small business, if there's a small business that's impacted, how do we determine whether or not that small business was truly impacted by the pandemic? So in other words, I've seen the PPP payroll protection program, and I've seen how it was applied throughout this country. Now, some can make the argument that entities receive significant dollars under the PPP that potentially didn't need it. I don't want to be in that same position as defending that I provided PPP or something similar to that for an entity that in fact, all it did was improve their bottom line. So if there is somebody that, I think that's going to be one of the things that we're going to have to struggle through. And I think, John, you're absolutely right. We're going to struggle through this whole next year, is how do we determine eligibility, and how do we determine that sector of the population was impacted economically negatively, and determine that. So I'm not really convinced at this point that we need to allocate 1/3 of it in 2022 because of the unknowns that I've just talked about.
Let me just, as a counter to that, and I see merit in that argument, but we're dealing with a pandemic and a pandemic relief and trying to get the economy back. And we can wait and wait and what ifs. There's $65 billion allocated for broadband. $43 billion of it is grants to states and locals. We don't know. We submitted $32 million of grants to the PSC. We got $150,000. We didn't do so well, with that grant application. The question becomes one of, we can do a lot of things contingent upon there not being other sources of revenue available, but sooner or later, we need to begin to have a plan by which we will try to help those people impacted by the pandemic out. And if you've got a process by which we can do it, great, but you need buckets to a degree so that you can do a comparative analysis of those projects within that bucket. If you want to create more of a contingency to let it float, that's fine. But sooner or later, we have to begin that process of allocating, and we can't wait for all the what-ifs because there will always be some. And I understand the desire to try to maximize the other aspects of it, but, childcare. We know that there are some critical issues of childcare that are affecting people in this room. The sooner we can develop a plan, if you want to carve out certain areas and say we're going to make, $1.5 million available for childcare, that's a legitimate approach. But sooner or later, we have to begin that process. We can't can't wait for that human capital bill, infrastructure bill to pass and it to be defined. We may make some mistakes, but we may also be ahead. Supervisor Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think to add to what you kind of just said is a lot of these issues that we're trying to address with pandemic relief funds weren't started because of the pandemic. These are things that have been exacerbated, that have been issues at the local level, state level, federal level for a really long time. You're talking about childcare. We can go back just in the county statistics and see how many providers we've lost in the last decade. So while I understand both sides of what we're talking about here, yes, I think we could probably pick some of these categories and make some of these allocations based solely on this problem probably isn't going to go away just because we allocate some of this money to it. It's going to help. And if further monies come down the line, that's going to help even more.
Any other, again, I think what we need to do is collectively, take what we learned and bring back a formal idea. Because ultimately, it's going to, not a proposal, because I think we're still at that concept stage. Other concerns that you would have?
Thank you, Chair. Just one question I would have. Would we have a way to get a general idea of, with the lost revenue calculation being roughly the 4.1%, would we have a general idea of being able to forecast that out more than just 1 year? And then we would have an idea of where that may fall rather than the 15% that's there now?
Yes.
Well, I think we can, we're very close. We're within a month and, 7 days of finalizing 2022, and we'll be able to then have an accurate number. It will take a little bit longer because we wait till the actual audit is completed. But we'll be able to determine what 2022's number is. The one thing that is very, very tough to calculate is what happens to sales tax. Because we know that the state revenue levy limits only allow us to take what net new construction is, which is not going to be 4.1%. So I don't think we're going to get to a zero net loss. Because we would have to make up potentially 2.1% in sales tax revenue to equal if we had a 2% increase in net new construction. So I think we could project it, but I think the other part of that equation that has clearly not been finalized yet is, and it's still being discussed, is so there's two parts to the 6.859 million lost revenue that's calculated for 2022, or 2020, excuse me. 3.6 of that is Marathon County direct. 3.183 of that is for Mount View. What we don't have in this whole calculation yet is the NCHC's portion, if there is some, to be allocated back to the county. The reason I bring that up is because the Mount View's calculation for next year, for 2020, is going to be the similar or maybe even greater than the 3.183 this year. What Marathon County's is yet to be determined. But we're missing NCHC's, so I think what I'm explaining is that I don't believe that there's going to be a problem potentially calculating the net lost revenue to equal or exceed the $26 million that's been allocated to the county from ARPA itself, because we have 4 years to calculate and capture net loss revenue. And unless we see a huge increase, we're going to have, and when there is the appropriate allocation from NCHC, there's going to be an additional loss, which may make the loss for 2020 in excess of 8 million, almost 9 million in county allocation.
How do you want, the question becomes, how do we, from a decisional perspective, the options are we adopt an allocation formula and set up buckets. If you use a Baker-Tilly approach, we need buckets. We need to define how much money we've got available, and whether it's lost revenue or direct allocation of the ARPA dollars, we still need buckets in which to place things. So if you have some thoughts on how we can go about doing that, if we're going to go out competitive, is it one bucket for all and we allocate the dollars? I think we talked about that earlier, and we said, well, we might want to compare projects within a bucket against each other. We really need to have a process, because we're going to get into requesting applications, and how do we allocate the funds? We could wait to develop the size of the buckets until the initial request, but some people are gonna say, well, how much money is there? So you've got a sort of a catch-22. Thoughts?
Two things. I think no matter how we allocate to the buckets, at some point, we're going to get into a discussion as to if we allocate so much to public safety or public health, and we have more application requests for public health than we do, say, for example, to any one of the other portions, we're going to get into a discussion on, do we make a transfer from X to Y because the merits of X is better than better than no applications in Y. And that's why I don't know that, not knowing what we're going to be receiving in request, do we make that allocation prior, or do we make that allocation after we see the applications? That's really the question, because then you can at least analyze the merit of the requests and potentially set up your, in other words, if the requests are less than the 8 million, and we've allocated 8 million, some 100,000, is the expectation then that everything gets awarded? That's a little bit of a caution because I'm not convinced that every application is worthy of the same request, or if
That would be an issue we're going to have to resolve, because we're going through 3 application processes. So of course, you're not going to have round 1 of 3 for the year where you're going to allocate 8.7. You're going to want to save some, so those are some of the discussions and the logistics we'll have to work through. So, we may have to look at thresholds, but again, we need a starting point for the process of evaluation. And, we'll probably need to do adjustments after round 1 of the 3-round applications in the year. But we need a starting point, and right now we don't have a starting point.
Mr. Chair, if I can.
Go ahead.
If I can reflect back what I think there's a lot of, my sense is there's a lot of agreement in the room on a couple of points. First and foremost, there's an agreement from an accounting perspective. However, we're going to, whatever projects we ultimately move forward, we're going to account from an audit perspective the funding mechanism for those from the lost revenue bucket as much as possible, particularly for those projects that don't very clearly fall within an otherwise expressed allocation. And I don't think there's any disagreement on that. Just as Chair Gibbs pointed out, that you want to minimize the likelihood of clawback. In terms of moving forward, perhaps, I know you're not slated for action today, but maybe in terms of homework for you to help you have a more fruitful discussion at your next meeting, within your packet, we again included the pages, it's headed Appendix 1, expenditure categories from the Department of Treasury. And then also, Chair Robinson, you included today kind of your, you kind of flushed out that same list, and you added what would be real or on-the-ground examples of each of those items. Perhaps
Potential.
Potential, correct. Perhaps it would be valuable for each of the committee members to go through a similar exercise with one additional step, that is, put money, allocate dollars, just for discussion purposes and thought process purposes individually within each of those areas. So under, let's talk about, the disproportionate impact services to disproportionately impacted communities. You know, you've talked about childcare. That's where childcare lives. If you wanted to fund a childcare project, you said, hey, we want to, you know, we're willing to put, I feel strongly about it, I'm willing to put $500,000 or $250,000 to find solutions to childcare issues. Put that in there. And if you go through each of those singular lines, you essentially can, over time, come up with the headings that you have, public health, negative economic impacts, and add up those dollars and see where you think the dollars should be spent. I think, to Chair Gibbs's point, if you take all of those, whatever projects we end up doing, you might have an other bucket that would be things that you would need to use lost revenue for because they don't fit. For example, if you wanted to fund roads, like, hey, we need to expand roads, upgrade our roads from where they're at now, we need a higher level of service, and I'm willing to put $1 million there, that needs to go in the other category. The projects that I just described about the PTO payout, that is an other category. It does not exist in any of the existing allocations. The nursing home is another category. As Chair Gibbs pointed out, you know, if you want to say, hey, we know we're going to be $2 million short and we don't have reserves, we know we need to fund that, put that in the other category. Then you kind of start to get a sense of where your funds are going to be allocated. But, you know, without doing that, there are so many things in each of these categories. I think it's a bit overwhelming to say, what do we want to spend on public health? That's a hard thing to talk about. But if you know, what do we need to do to address the increase in mental health services and the budget shortfalls at North Central, and you start to say, we know that's about $1 million or $2 million, I think you start to chip away at the things that I think you're going to have. I expect very little disagreement, quite honestly, at this committee about when you actually get projects in front of you, you're going to fund the things that you all agree on. But it's difficult to have those conversations right now because it's such a large, complex animal. But going through what Chair Robinson did and kind of giving, you know, what would actually be examples or potential examples of the projects, and then allocating money to them, you start to get an idea of where your priorities lie. Because I think there's a lot of agreement. It's just going through that exercise, I think, would be helpful, because otherwise you could have this conversation for another hour.
There's a lot of devil in the detail. And, you know, what we did was we took lists that were suggested by the public. Some of them were poorly defined and some of them are just not doable. But, you know, for childcare, I would just encourage you, I like Lance's suggestion, just put a sum in for childcare. There were 4, 5, 6 points for childcare, and I don't think you have to lump each one of them, but look at it. That might be a way for us to begin that discussion and looking at what those allocations might be like. And one of the things that I'd like to know in the context of lost revenue from the North Central and the nursing home, are those paper losses associated with 4.1% revenue growth, or what is the difference between an actual loss relative to the bottom line versus the revenue loss relative to the growth in revenues? And I think that might give us a better feel of, are there some real critical needs that we don't really have a choice in addressing, because you again have that paper loss, if you will, and then you've got an actual loss. And
This is not based on the 4.1%. This is based
Actual
on
loss.
actual loss.
But it's revenue, so it's not how much they spend.
Correct. It's revenue lost, again. So there's a distinction. In other words, you lost revenue,
your expenses.
but you potentially spent less. In some cases, that's the truth, but some cases, it isn't, because the fact is you still had the staff, and in some cases, in the nursing home in particular, if you had someone out, you didn't have a choice. You still had to provide the healthcare services to the patients that you had. So you still had to go out, and in some cases so there's not, clearly there was not the same offset in lost revenue as there was in reduction in expenses. So
But
that-
it might be helpful for us to understand both. You know,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, what were our actual bottom line
Well,
audited loss?
I won't have that unless you specifically ask.
Because we have two purposes here. One purpose is to determine what is an eligible lost revenue, and the other thing is trying to make people whole within that. And the difference is we can take the paper one to inflate the value of the lost revenue, but at the end of the day, if we're running a deficit at the end of the year, we have to somehow deal with that, whether it's out of reserves or out of a supplemental appropriation.
Well, I will say this, that it's clearly a loss in actual reserves at NCHC, and it is not just a loss on paper, because the target reserves that NCHC has for Marathon County is between 8 and 16 million, and we are well below that as far as our target. And it is occurred or has been incurred over the last 3 years to the tune that NCHC combined. Part of it is a little bit of in that there's now 2 nursing homes that are being reported in this total loss, and that is Pinecrest now is contractually under, Pinecrest being Lincoln County's nursing home, is also now incorporated in the total combined financials of NCHC. But NCHC virtually lost $2 million in 2019, $4 million in 2020, and it's projected to lose $5 million in 2021. And its current budget, with the request for about, I think it was 600,000 additional funding from Marathon County, was still at $2-point-some million loss for next year. So there's some significant challenges, and now next year did have in it one additional expense, and that is accounting for $1.8 million in debt service. So the $2.8 million projected loss did include the 1.8 in debt service. So if you take that out, it's still $1 million in paper, or well, $1 million in actual physical loss. But so I provide that in context so that this group can put that in context in where there may need some additional resources from the ARPA funds to stabilize. Again, part of it is pandemic, a good part of it is pandemic related, in that you continued to have staffing for inpatient hospitals, for the mental health patients, for the nursing home patients, and then we were putting online the youth hospital and the youth hospital beds, and so staffing has to be accommodated for all of those, whether we have patients in the facility or not. So,
But we need to try to quantify that as best we can and what that's out, and then we evaluate that in the context of the other needs, because North Central would probably take a good portion of that 26 million. I'm not sure that the county board would go for allocating all of that. So we need to better understand the value of that, what it means, both in the context of the reserves, their cash flow, and other things. But again, going back to the concept that Lance, or Administrator Leonard, laid out of trying to do the homework and going through the the expenditure categories. And again, it was a quick review of trying to take those and put those in some areas. I know that it's a stretch in some areas, but we can look at it in the context of either direct allocation or allocation of lost revenues in those where we have more flexibility. If you could do that, I think it would be nice to compile that. Sooner or later, we're going to need a number for what North Central Healthcare, what we're comfortable as a county board allocating to North Central Healthcare. We'll need that bucket defined. And I think that will be based on audit and reserves and the impact of that. So is everybody okay with trying to do that? And I would suggest we really try to be present at the meeting when we do that, and we kind of throw things, if we can, at a board or a spreadsheet and capture them. So at the end of the day, we I think that's a face-to-face discussion versus it's difficult to do it remotely and to be engaged if we can. So is that a path forward?
Yeah, we'll make sure we'll have some way to capture that when you come back and have those discussions, but
So
Just
that
a
gets
thought.
into, our next meeting is the 7th, scheduled for the 7th. We've got a request to move it. Our next meeting would, after that would be the 20,
I don't have one scheduled for
we don't have one scheduled, so
They've never had one on
given ARPA and where we are, is there a need for us to meet sometime later in December? Or potentially a separate, I know the holidays gets chaotic for everyone. Do we want to just look at potentially a special meeting in early January? Because I don't know that this could, we want to wait till the end of January at our next educational meeting to address this. And I'm not sure that we could at a regular meeting. So skip the one in December, look for one in early January, maybe we'll do a doodle poll. But I think that this would be, really to do it right, we're going to need a meeting on nothing but this.
But our next scheduled meeting is changing from the 7th?
Well, and we'll jump right to that item. I know that Administrator Leonard and Chair Gibbs have a conflict on the 7th. They have asked if it would be possible for us to move it. And so I would, would the 8th work for people?
That was supposed to be our 3:30 start time.
Those are 3:30 start time. We can start it. My day, that day is completely open for me, so would that day work for people to move it?
It's over by like 5:30, yes.
8th is a Wednesday.
I believe there's a City-County Information Technology Commission meeting starting at 7:30 that day. That should be done by about 9. We then have a presentation from this is just my calendar, so bear with me. Presentation on our projects from the university program starting at 11. And a North Central Healthcare, that meeting should go till about 12:30, and then North Central Healthcare's executive meeting is from 1 to 5.
You're saying the 8th or the 7th?
The 8th.
He's saying the 8th.
Oh, I'm sorry, the 8th.
We're looking at the 8th.
Yeah.
Day late or day early?
Yeah, I'll be there.
8th, I'm open.
Yeah.
I can do Wednesday the 8th in the afternoon.
I'm available on the 8th as well.
So that would be our regular action meeting. So 3:30 on the 8th, we'll just move it back a day. And then because Craig's not here, I'd like to, for the ARPA, what we'll need to do is talk to Lance and see how long it will take us to pull together some of this and for you to do your homework. What we might try to do is get an email out to you outlining what the expectations are to follow up and put everything together in one attachment so you have it. Please do not respond to that email, because then we get into issues of a walking quorum. So we'll send it out with the expectation you come to the meeting.
And that'll be before the 8th?
This would not, the meeting on the 8th is, our December
Regular
7th meeting is
action
moving to
will be-
the 8th. That's our approve the bills, do the other, I don't know if we've got a lot, we've tax deeds, other things.
So this would be the
Right.
January meeting.
Right, our
Okay.
special January meeting. Then we will not meet later this month, and we'll look at a date. If that's agreeable,
December 8th at 8, or at 3:30?
yes.
Okay, got it.
All right. Anything else on ARPA? Okay. Molly, you're up.
Oh, sure.
All right, thanks. I'll set the stage here on these contracts. So the negotiations were done under a unique climate, as you can imagine, much like everything else in our lives right now. But COVID-19 aside, there's been some ongoing social justice riots and civil unrest that in the past year that's caused some concerns over recruitment and retention of law enforcement officers. So again, that was the undercurrent going into these negotiations. And couple that with the highest inflation rate in decades, you can imagine the bulk of our dialogue was around wage adjustments and progression advancements, because the progression advancements in the prior contract didn't take place until July of 2021. We did not consider any additional change to the progression, but we did come to a 3-year agreement with a 3% lift in the first year, and then 2-1 splits in January and July of year 2 and 3, which each equate to an overall base salary increase of 2.51% year over year. So the actual cost increase from 2021 to 2022 will equate to $122,862. The increase from 2022 to 2023 will be $105,878. The year over year increase for 2024 will be $108,536. And just for reference, the progression advancements that went into effect this past year created a year-over-year increase from 2020 to 2021 of $309,729. So keeping the goal of attracting and retaining talent in mind and having researched comparable peer contracts, I am very comfortable with our bargaining settlements. Any questions?
Any questions? Any questions? I think it's fair in light of what we're hearing. Any motions? We need to, Kurt?
I guess just. The one thing that I think we've all still heard is the need for a comprehensive pay study. And even though the negotiations and this took place, I think there's still a significant need to understand what those potential costs are going to be in the future. I don't know that this doesn't effectively address that, but I would make a motion that we approve the negotiated settlement with the law enforcement element of the county.
Is there a second? Seconded by Fisher. Any discussion? If not, all's in favor of recommending approval of the contract to the county board will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. 2018 to 22 strategic plan, I'm going to hold that over pending Vice Chair McEwen's availability. I think during that discussion, we'll also revisit in some detail our work plan. I think they go hand in hand. So we'll have that discussion when Craig can be here, and he had a commitment, family commitment. So anything else? Our next meeting date is now the 8th versus the 7th. If not, is there a motion to adjourn? Moved by Arstad, seconded by Fisher. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. We are adjourned. So Kurt, we should sit down maybe next week. You,
The form come through.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. I put it in